Hello, today we are back with another video on akYtec, ALP and mini PLCs. This time we will discuss macroses. First, let's define what macroses are and why they are useful. A macro is essentially a piece of an algorithm hidden in a compact form that can be called onto your program's canvas. They are beneficial in two main situations. The first is when you have a large and bulky project, which becomes difficult to handle. In this case, you can pack parts of it into macros and extract them as small blocks on the screen. Then connect them properly and you are there. This way, your main canvas will display a compact and legibly written program, broken down into separate blocks. If you need to see how they work, you can always enter the macro editor and make adjustments or simply view its structure. The second situation where you might need a macro is when object typing is required. For example, if you have a pumping station with several pumps operating on the same algorithm, it's much more convenient to create a macro for this algorithm. Later, you can drag the necessary number of these macros onto your program's canvas, representing the pumps, and connect their respective input and output signals. Now let's move on to the practice. The first thing we will learn to do with macros is to create them. To create a macro, go to the File menu and select Create Macro. Then, decide on the number of inputs and outputs for this macro and click OK button. You will enter the macro editing window, where you will see a canvas for crafting the algorithm. This algorithm is created just like in the main program. Place the necessary blocks and connect them. On the right and left, you will find the macros, inputs and outputs. If you look into their properties, you can select the type for each input or output, meaning the value it will pass to the macro, Boolean, integer or real. You can also give a new name to its input or output. For example, input 1. This name will be used not only within the macro, but also on the main program canvas when the macro is placed. And if you forgot to add some inputs and outputs or want to delete an unnecessary one, that's easily done too. If you enter the properties of the macro itself by clicking on an empty canvas, you can set the following parameters. Macro name, default is unnamed, so you need to assign one. A brief description of the macro, developer, the group to which the macro belongs for better navigation between them, and the last setting is a password for access to edit the macro. After you have created your macros workflow, you can save it using the Save Workplace icon at the top of the Edit Macro window. Click on it and your macro will be saved in your project under the name you have devised. You can find it in the component library and then drag it onto the workplace. And as you can see, the names for inputs and outputs that I used inside the macro are also displayed on its icon on the main canvas. This was the first method of creating macros, but now there is a faster way. Suppose you already have a project part which you want to pack into a macro. For this, select the elements you want to place into the macro, right-click on any of them, and choose New Macro. ALP automatically creates a macro with the necessary types of inputs and outputs according to the elements that are connected to them. Pay attention to the temperature input. It's named after the temperature variable. Inputs 1, 2, and 3, as well as output Q1, are named just like the main PR. This macro can also be edited. For this, right-click on it and select Edit Macro. In the editor, you can see the working algorithm. As you see, all these elements that were selected have been moved here. And please note that inside the macro, its own intermediate variables are created, which are not identical to those in the main program. Inside the macro, there is a separate temperature helper variable. This macro can also be named, described, assigned to its developer, a group name, and a password for access. All these settings are the same as those we did for the manually created macro. After completing all settings, it must be saved just the same. Then, this macro will appear in the component library and can be used as needed in the workplace. If you want to edit your macros algorithm, for example, to add another output or to connect a signal to it, then save this macro. Upon returning to the main scheme, you will see a message from ALP indicating that the macro has been modified and needs to be updated through the context menu. Right-click on it, select Update Macro, and it updates according to the saved information. It will have an additional output, and now it can be successfully used in the main project. The first method of creating a macro from scratch is very suitable for creating typed objects, like the pump I mentioned at the beginning. And the second method of creating a macro through the context menu and selecting the necessary amount of elements is great for packing parts of algorithms into a macro to make your algorithm more readable and clear. Also, I would like to point out that when using the second method, all connection lines that were connected to the elements now packed into the macro remain connected as usual. There are nuances, but in most cases this is true. Here we use macro within a single project, but we are not limited to that. Macro can also be transferred between projects. To do this, we go into the editing menu of the macro we want to transfer to another project. Go to the File menu and select Export. Then you need to choose the name of the export file and where you plan to save it, let's say the desktop, under the name My Macro. Now, this file can be imported into a new project for another PR, or for another object, or for anything else. In the newly created project, go to the File menu, select Import. Choose the export file stored on your desktop, and in Components Library, our macro now appears. It can also be edited, changed, and saved within this project. For example, under a new name, and then this edited macro can also be exported, thus gradually creating your collection of macros. Additionally, it's worth noting that within macros, besides functional blocks, you can also use other macros, downloaded from the online database, created manually, or imported into the project. Thus, previously created macros can serve as parts of foundation for creating new elements. As you can see, creating and editing macros in ALP is very simple, and Thanks to the export-import functions, you can create your library of macros to use in different projects. In the next video, we will dive deeper into the topics of macroses. But for now, subscribe to our channel to not miss new videos and leave comments. Thank you for watching. See you next time.